Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for attending this session. My name is Jacinta Muteshi Strawn. I will be the moderator for this session. In my everyday life, I am the team lead for a program called, let me begin with the acronym, TGG-ALM, which stands for the Girl Generation Support to Africa-Led Movement to End FGM. I am based in Nairobi, and that's where we work. However, our program covers 4 regions. So Kenya, Ethiopia, Somaliland, and Senegal. So we were created about a decade ago as a flagship program funded by the UK Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, FCDO, to support such movements to end FGM. So TGG, as we tend to use just those first part of that acronym TGG, is a brand that amplifies the voices and leadership of those at the forefront of change, from grassroots communities to global advocacy platforms. TGG has left its mark of championing survivors, building partnerships, and shaping the way we talk about FGM. A key ethical principle that underpins how we work is a commitment to do no harm. Because the work we do very often triggers pain, harm, and even violence again. So for the panel we have here today, I want to say the following, and it applies to the panel, but also applies to everybody in the room. Often, when we do this work, it does trigger for people a memory of violence. So I would recommend, if you're not comfortable with the discussion, do please leave the room. It's perfectly all right to leave the room. And for everybody else here also, as you speak, be mindful about those who might be present in the room for whom this is indeed painful and violent experiences. So working with survivors is about reporting on gender-based violence. It's amplifying the stories of survivors without harming them. For African women, these stories were disappearing, particularly stories around survival and survivors. We don't use the language of victimhood. We focus more on the fact that young women and girls are indeed survivors of this violence. But it's not enough to simply tell these stories. There must be an intent. So we're intentional in why we tell these stories. We have an ambition, essentially, to end violence against girls and against women. So again, a very, very warm welcome to all of you. I have here a panelist of 3. I will be asking them a series of questions, at the end of which we will open up some space for you to comment, reflect, or ask any questions to these panelists. But I'll begin by just first saying their names, and then when they answer the first question, they'll tell you a little bit more about themselves. So seated on my far right is Leila Hussein. Leila and I work together at the Girl Generation, and she herself is an advocate, a survivor, telling these very powerful stories around FGM. Seated next to her is Janine Giovanni of the Reckoning Project, who reports a lot on conflict and justice. And seated to my immediate right is Eliza Anyangwe of the Fuller Project. Again, going to talk to us more about storytelling. So let me begin with my first question to you, Leila. Can you speak about why you submitted this session proposal? In other words, why are we here? And what inspired it? And why has it felt important to do so now?
Yep. Thank you. For those of you, I think we use the word FGM. So for those of you who don't know what FGM is, it stands for female genital mutilation. So if you've never heard of it, it's violence subjected to girls where their genitalia is partially or totally removed, sometimes stitched from head, from bottom to top, where there's a little hole that's left. Sometimes not even a matchstick can go through it. So I'm just going to leave you with that for a little bit so you understand the content of what we're speaking for. So why did I submit this session? For one, for many, many years, FGM survivors have been left out from the conversation around gender-based violence because FGM hasn't been recognized as a form of gender-based violence. It was always seen as traditional cultural practice, harmful practice. So you can see the language itself really has an impact on how we've been seeing this issue. So for me, when at the Girl Generation, one of the things that we did early on was to develop a survivor-led initiative. So this initiative, what it does, we teach survivors who exist in these spaces and how to keep themselves safe in terms of emotional care, access to funding. But most importantly, one of the reasons I wanted this to be, I was so passionate about this. I'm a survivor myself. I'm a writer. I'm a psychotherapist. I've been harmed. I've also harmed others in this space. The intention was never to harm, but sometimes our behaviors, our acts can cause harm. As a survivor, many times when I was interviewed by journalists, even though the journalist's role is to amplify those stories, and journalists have helped us change policies, laws, however, I was harmed in those spaces. And so really that was the aim for us. And I want us to think about today as a way, it's a beginning of a conversation, hopefully in this festival. And I would like to encourage you all to really begin to think about whether you're a writer, a journalist, or a content creator, how do I ensure that we don't do any harm? So that's why. So it's just the beginning of a conversation, hopefully.
Thank you, Leila.
Yep.
And a quick follow-up to that would be, how do gender-related crimes impact survivors differently than other forms of violence?
I mean, it impacts, it impacts them in a different way, right? So it's different. So if, for example, it impacts them psychologically. When you undergo any kind of form of gender-based violence, for example, if I use, again, the FGM example, a child is brought into a room, pinned to a table, legs spread apart. Forget about the cutting. So you can imagine that itself is already a crime. So it impacts them psychologically. It's a long-term psychological impact. It affects them economically also, because people don't think about the economic impact that it has, because a girl who has been subjected to this violence, I don't want to use the word undergone or practice, by the way. I would like to keep us away from the word practice, because no one practices violence. It's violence, okay? So it impacts economically, because a lot of the girls end up having serious physical damage, long-term damage, where they can't now go to school or be at work. So you can imagine the impact. So and now they're subjected to other forms of violence. I don't like the term child marriage, because there's no such thing as a child being married. This is another form of pedophilia that we also need to discuss it in that form. So the impact goes from physical, psychological, social, because a lot of us know, survivor of especially sexual, any form of violence, what we tend to do in society is that we blame. I don't like to use the word victim, we blame the survivor. There's a stigma from the community. And one thing I learned as a therapist in this space, because I specialize in working with survivors of sexual violence and torture. And one thing I learned early on was the harm is not necessarily the act that happened, it's how society has reacted to them. So how the police, the legal system has dealt with them, how their families have dealt with them, how the justice, the very biased, terrible justice system we still have, that's really, and then obviously the journalist who could be interviewing for her story. So the harm, so really this is how this is the harm that we need to really think about in avoiding, yeah.
Thank you very much, Leila. Let me turn to you, Eliza, and really it's building on the context that Leila has laid and ask you this question. What does it mean to tell stories with survivors rather than about them?
Yes. Hi, everyone. So first, let me just introduce myself very briefly. My name is Eliza Nyangwe. I am the editor-in-chief of the Fuller Project, which is a newsroom that focuses on stories that about issues that disproportionately affect women and LGBTQ people. Our journalism is largely what would be called accountability journalism, where we are basically trying to hold to account. We're trying to expose harm and hold to account. And yeah, we have a team that is based all over the world, and I live in Amsterdam, from where I do this work. And so, of course, because we focus on issues that disproportionately affect women, a lot of the stories that we report on are about gender-based violence. I have experience also doing so at CNN, where I ran the gender inequality reporting team there. And in all these roles, thinking about this very question, what does it mean to work with and not just tell stories about? It can be quite subtle, and so forgive me if you are a reporter who's been doing this for many years and you're like, this is exactly what I do already. It's really just about intention and acknowledging what you want from an experience. The truth is, a bit like Leila said, journalism can be extractive. We come in with an idea of a story that we wish to tell. Our intentions may be good. We want to shed light. We want to hold to account. And we need a character, right? Because our work is different from academic work, which might just be about numbers and stats, because we tell it through the vehicles of people's experiences. And so you need a character who's willing to talk to you, to tell you their story. And what we can do is extractive in that we find someone and they have a compelling story. It's very interesting when you spend time talking to journalists, and when they tell you something is a good story, it usually means it's dreadful, right? So something is like, oh, juicy, that's a good story, right? Because we are drawn to really compelling examples of human experience, and it's often experience of harm. And then we document, we ask lots of questions, and because we also have to fact check and prove that it is accurate, and we tend to ask people for proof that the things that they say have happened to them have happened to them. And we go through this very rigorous process to tell your story, and then we leave. And then we go and work on another story. And sometimes if you're doing that work well, it might take you a few days, but other times you can come in, arrive today, do your story, and be on the next flight. Or sometimes, even worse, I will name no names, there are newsrooms that don't actually themselves send their reporters to cover it. They ask someone else on the ground, who is often not even named in the story, to get the bits that they need. Hey, I'm not naming names, though. I do not want a fight. I will neither agree nor deny. Yes, well, and others too. Yeah. So there are these practices that mean our industry and the ways in which we deal with people and their stories. This precious thing that they have to tell. To give us is quite extractive. And so in thinking about how we remedy those ways of working, there are lots of different places along the sort of what I would call the journalism workflow where you can start to think about that. The first thing is in recognizing that experience is a form of expertise. Something that has happened to you gives you a type of expertise. There is nothing worse than if you are living in a neighborhood where there is no running water, you are invited to talk about how horrible it is to live without running water. But when there's a conversation about where to put the taps or what the price of water should be, you are not involved in that. No, there is an expert over there. Wouldn't you be pissed off, right? Like, your lived experience is a form of expertise. And so recognizing that victims of of gender-based violence, by virtue of that experience, have a form of expertise. And so oftentimes when we are working on an investigations or on series, starting with what I call listening circles, where you bring together people who have lived through the thing, or the different stakeholders, for want of a better term, is recognizing that actually before you actually get to the place where you are reporting the story, you have given these people an opportunity to help inform your journalism. So that is one way of working with. The other ways, there are lots, and we don't have enough time, but I'll just give one more example of how to tell stories with and not about. Offering people the opportunity to be in your reporting in multiple ways, in the sense that, again, this is related to the first point. There is a risk. Very recently I was reading a story where the victims were Black and brown women in the global south, and then the people who were informing what should happen next were all in the global north. And asking those people, you know, what do you want the outcome of this to be? How do you see justice? How do you understand justice? I think FGM is a very good example where I sometimes wonder whether the ways in which in certain Western countries we have understood what justice is, which is built around legal systems and not, for example, restorative justice or other forms of justice that the survivors might prefer. And there is a role in our journalism where we're not just revealing harms, but also asking, what should a society organized better look like? What should it look like to be done right? And if we are centering our own experience, our own sense of what does justice mean, which is a criminal justice system, lock them up and throw away the key, we don't actually think about the repercussions sometimes in communities where there is harm and there should be just remedy, but that might look very different to how that just remedy looks in our communities.
Thank you very much, Eliza. And yes, and
Oh, bless your heart.
yes,
I'll pay you all
and
later.
And in fact, building on that, because what Eliza's done is raised the discussion and the reflection around what does justice look like, what does it mean to be engaged ethically in this work. So my follow-up question is to you, Janine. When you reflect on your work in humanitarian and globally and in conflict zones, how do you navigate justice pathways and accountability when covering sexual violence and torture? I know it's a very big one, but a real critical one.
Hello? Okay. Thank you so much for coming out on this beautiful day, and I'm very honored to be on a panel of such amazing women. I am the CEO of the Reckoning Project, and we're a war crimes unit largely based in Ukraine, but we're also beginning to work in Darfur, Syria, and other parts of the Middle East. But before that, I was a war reporter for 35 years. So I went through 18 wars, 3 genocides. So I saw a lot and I learned a lot. But I think what I'm going to talk about is something really painful for me, but also perhaps a lesson that you can learn from it, because I certainly learned from it. During the war in Kosovo in 1999, I was assigned to do a very big investigation, 3-month long, of sexual violence that occurred in one village in Kosovo. So literally, the entire village of women were taken away, put in a house, repeatedly violated, raped, and other horrible things happened to them. I had someone with me, a translator and an assistant, who a colleague at Human Rights Watch had worked with, and she said she was excellent. So we set out working in the refugee camps, finding the witnesses, beginning to take testimonies. Very, very difficult, we were discussing this earlier, to especially Muslim women. It's very hard for them to talk about what happened to themselves, and they often will never use the word rape or violate it. They say, I was touched. But as we worked diligently and carefully, the stories came out. So we spent weeks and weeks and weeks taking these testimonies, which were very horrifying. And at one point, I noticed my interpreter was getting more and more bizarre, her habits. And she wanted to go to the front line. She was just acting really erratically. I'll make a really long story short, but it turned out at one point, about 6 weeks into our work, she had a complete psychotic break. And it was really horrific. And she told me, she sat in my room and she was crying and shaking, and she said that when the war started in Pristina, she had been kidnapped essentially by some local Albanian men and gang raped. And she didn't tell anyone about it, and she couldn't talk about it. But yet she went through this process with me for 6 weeks, taking testimony about other people. And then she crashed completely. And to give credit to my former newspaper, we got her out and got her hospitalized in London. But she wanted me to write about what happened to her. And before she left, we sat down. I talked to her at great length. She wanted me to tell her story. I was really careful. I changed her name. And this is something we might talk about, like how to report when you're doing things like this. I changed her name. I changed her physical appearance. And I thought I had disguised her well. But what I didn't know, and this is before social media, okay, so you have to imagine a world where, you don't use your phone to get the news. When my story came out in the Times of London, where I worked, it was picked up by a local newspaper in Pristina, and they translated it and published it in her country. And because she was recognizable to people because she had been an acting student, she was in a cafe where everyone was killed except her on the first day of the war, so everyone knew it was her. So I cannot tell you the shame and the horror I felt, because our guiding principle at the Reckoning Project is do no harm. I mean, that's every humanitarian's mantra, and should be every journalist's mantra as well. But in my trying to report about what had happened to these women, I had damaged someone desperately. And I have to say, I never forgave myself for that. But I did learn from it, and it is something, I don't talk about very often, so, it's interesting to be sharing it in a room full of people. But it is a lesson learned about, maybe my intuition that I didn't pick up earlier on her own trauma, but also about if you are working with local people, and the Reckoning Project, we only work with local people. We don't use foreign human rights investigators. We only use Ukrainians, Sudanese, Gazans, Ethiopians. They have to be from the country to give them back agency and an agency over their own justice system. But I had really missed something, and it's something now I think about a lot, and also think about how do we protect our journalists or our researchers from not just re-traumatizing the survivor that they're taking the testimony from. And there's a very specific procedure you need to do, which I think Layla as a therapist will talk about. But how do you protect yourself or your researcher, especially if you're diving deep into some pretty dark stuff? You need to take care of yourself as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much, Janine. Thank you for sharing that. The whole point, of course, and we often don't think about it, is that we do want to amplify stories, right? We want the world to know where the abuses, the violence is. But clearly what we are sharing here is it has consequences that we may not have anticipated or have the skills to address, or even the awareness to address. So we can re-traumatize. That's very true. So thank you for sharing that very powerful story. So Eliza, again, really building on that, how do we ensure, because that's the whole point, that our stories do empower, that they do not exploit? Because what we want to do, yes, is balance advocacy and journalistic responsibility. Again, it's complex.
Yeah, so I will divide that
briefly.
up into two, because the first bit, which is how do we not re-traumatize?
Yes.
I think the first thing when you are approaching someone as a storyteller, a filmmaker, a journalist, is to be honest, and really to have thought about, at the Fuller Project, we work a lot in partnership with other newsrooms, and at CNN, we had our own, a very large platform, is to be really, really honest with the person you are interviewing about where the story is likely to get to, especially now in a digital age, right? Because you want that story, but I think if you run the risk of sort of dumbing down or playing down the risk of something coming back to them, essentially you want the person who is telling you their story to make an informed decision to give consent, right? You don't want to pretend that, oh, I work for a small publication, it's not gonna get anywhere. We all know that small story on the internet somewhere that went viral, right? And then suddenly someone is a superstar and you are on the internet forever, right? And so really think, having an honest conversation with someone about what it means for them to tell their story, and walking that line between giving them that information and being infantilizing, where you're basically making the decision for them. Oh, I'm not sure, this is safe to tell. Like, if somebody like the person you described feels compelled to tell their story, oftentimes, especially in cases of oppression, where people don't have access to many other tools and privileges, their story is the one thing that they have. And so if you give them the information and the knowledge they have, they should make the informed decision about whether to tell their story, rather than you saying, I will protect you on your behalf, and I'll choose what we tell or not tell. So I think that is an important part, sort of being really honest with people. Also being honest, I think, especially with journalists who are not advocates in the same way as, my newsroom focuses on issues that disproportionately affect women, but today that could be, reproductive health, and tomorrow that could be climate. We are not working on one issue in the same way that campaigners or advocates might be. And so when you build a relationship with someone to build the trust necessary for them to tell your story, the truth is we will then also move on to another subject, and really sort of telling people that, so that they, there is a responsibility that we have, but also a finite, a sort of end period in our standard engagement as journalists that we have to think about how we navigate. I don't think that the answer to that is really straightforward. I know some newsrooms, including ones I've worked with before, that have done really interesting things in figuring out where do we take the data, the research, the storytelling, and who do we hand the information over to so that there is life beyond the journalism. But the fact is that a lot of journalists, even the ones who work on series for a year, then move on to other subjects, right? And there is an honesty we have to be with people about that, because they come to sort of depend on us, expect things from us when they tell us their stories. And then to the part of your question, which is, the distinction between advocacy and journalism, I would start by saying, oftentimes there is an accusation that journalism can be advocacy when it is trying to serve communities who have been traditionally underserved by the media. And that those who hold power in newsrooms, say, well, isn't that advocacy, in this sort of snide way? And what I would suggest, often how I reply to this, is that actually the people who worked on the Panama Papers wanted to see change happen too, right? Like, there is nobody who is doing any type of journalism, particularly if it is revelatory, who doesn't want to see something change in the world because of that. My concern is with the communities on the margins. That doesn't make me any more of an advocate than the people who wanted to see accountability with Enron after the economy crashed in 2008, right? So that is the first thing to acknowledge, is who is asking this question about advocacy. And then the second part of it is to actually acknowledge that there is, again, an end to our journalistic responsibilities. I might reveal and and also tell stories, asking questions about what do solutions look like, but I do not advocate for any one solution over another. There are umpteen world-building opportunities available, and there are people who have expertise, whether it's academics or civil society experts, to then duke out what is that world we want to be in. And my job is to reveal and hold to account all the parties, rather than to put forward a specific vision of the new world that we want to live in. And that is where the baton can be handed over from journalists to advocates, and they take our journalism and try and catalyze change in much more specific ways than we do within our role.
Thank you, Liza. Thank you.
You really need to stop doing this, guys. Like, it would be like, no, she's just asked me, are they your students? I bust them all in. It's a Trump rally, really. These are all.
So, Janine, back to you, and this time is focusing on conflict contexts. What does responsible, trauma-informed reporting look like during times of conflict?
So not to do what I did in Kosovo, for the first thing. So I think that it's really important. I actually recommend to most people to read the Dart Center at Columbia University. Has a really excellent page on reporting sexual violence. So at the Reckoning Project, what we do now is take testimony that will be admissible in court. So we're actively trying to build cases against perpetrators. And I can tell you that I've learned a lot about things that I didn't know as a journalist. For instance, with victims of sexual violence or children, you have to have either a psychologist or a member of the law enforcement with you in the room. You can't just, and you've seen journalists, I've seen, excuse me, but TV journalists in Iraq after the fall of Saddam with children that were burnt horribly in beds, and they would come in with the full crew, with the, you know, the sound thing, the furry sound thing, and stick a mic in a kid's face who can say, like, how do you feel? And I'm not exaggerating. You wouldn't think that people would have that lack of sensitivity, but they do. When there's an editor back in London or New York saying, you know, get that story. So you cannot interview someone who's been harmed without having an expert in the room, someone like Layla, a psychologist or a police officer. You have to bring them to a safe space, right? So you first, you say, where would you like to go? You know, where would you feel comfortable? Do you want to bring your sister with us, or a friend, or is there someone you want in the room? So you just try to make them feel as safe as possible. Also, another thing that won't work in court is if you take testimony from someone who is traumatized. So let's say in the intermediate of a bombing, right? And you talk to someone about what happened, what did you see? And they begin to talk in a way that usually their timeline is kind of garbled. People that have been deeply traumatized, their memories get lapsed. So that's one way of recognizing it and realizing that maybe you shouldn't be getting your story then. You know, you should be letting this person either get medical help or, you know, calm down from what they've just seen. I think that with the world going the way it is right now, and let's admit it, we're in extremely dark times, a time when human rights are under grievous attack, and all of us are trying to find our own way of how do we navigate this, how do we keep working. It's really important that we keep doing these kind of stories. I mean, what Eliza was talking about and how important advocacy is, I'm a human rights defender. That's what people call me, that's what I call myself. And I don't know, you know, the line between journalism and being a human rights defender, because essentially what we're trying to do is shine a light, what one of our colleagues once said, shine a light in the darkest corners. And to give a voice, especially to the people that don't have it. And those are the people that I gravitate towards. The people that have no access to CNN or AP or, you know, or even local BBC radio or Voice of America, God rest its soul. And you know, to find a way for these people to have a voice. The other just really important thing I'd point out, and it goes back to your point about consent. What I found, I just got back from Syria, and I hadn't been there since I got kicked out by the regime in 2012 first, and then I went back to Aleppo many times, so 2015, so 10 years I hadn't been back. And it was extraordinary because I was so used to Syrian people either looking over their shoulder to see if the Mukhabarat, the secret police, were following us, or there was a listening device. I mean, people who had lived for 40 years under extensive state terror were unable to speak. So I go back, and the first people I wanted to talk to were the people released from prison who had sustained terrible, terrible sexual violence, and the chemical gas survivors. And what made me, it was just extraordinary how they wanted to talk. But then the saddest thing they told me, the chemical gas survivors, after they went through this terrible experience, most of them lost their entire families in front of them. The next day, the Assad regime people came to them and said, that wasn't a chemical attack, by the way. It was the rebels who burned tires, and those noxious fumes killed your family. And they would say, no, that's not what happened. We saw the bombs. And they're like, really? You're going straight to Sednaya prison. And so not only were they silenced once, but they were then silenced again. And I think it's for these kind of people that we do this work, the people that don't have a voice. And they are the most vulnerable people in our society, and the people as journalists, storytellers, activists, therapists, we need to actively get their story out there. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Janine. So over to you, Leila, which is sort of the final substantive question before I come back to everyone. Given what you've just heard, what kind of healing and justice do survivors need? And how are these often overlooked?
I mean, clearly, just from this conversation, I think just the conversations that's been happening for the last, I think, days we've been here, it's very clear that actually, it's, emotional support, it's absolutely not just needed, I think it's paramount to this work. I'm sitting here just hearing you two, and I'm like, oh my God, this is a crime that journalists have not been given any of these skills, because you can clearly see where the risk is happening over and over again. Because I know as an activist, as an advocate, I needed the media to amplify what I'm trying to push out there. So I mean, I hope after this festival, we can all go back and really reflect on, for example, if we doing a budget for something, actually include emotional well-being as part of your budgets. Like, it's so critical. It's not a choice. But then coming back to the question around survivors, for example, if I talk to the example of what we did with the girl generation, there's so many women's movement, girls' movements, but the one bit we kept forgetting was the emotional support. And what do we do? We always prance, girls right in front of these events on International Women's Day, Zero Tolerance Day, go and tell your story, you're amazing, and then boom, we leave this person behind. So what we did at the girl generation is we actually co-created a survivor-led initiative with the women. So they are also a part, because I come with my British accent. Yes, I'm a therapist. Yes, I can share the skills, but they know their environment more than anyone. So it was really important that we created this space with the women, so they now began to develop what this guide should look like for them. And really recognizing, part of the guide is really to learn about trauma. A lot of people think, when you mention mental health in certain communities, they think you should be locked up, not realizing, not being able to get out of bed, having a brain fog is a part of, is anxiety. So really going to the basics of learning about mental health issues. So that's really critical to this work. But what we've seen from that work is how empowered the survivors are. Actually, we call them survivor experts. So they're not just a survivor who sits on a stage and tells a story. She's an expert in that particular area where she's at. So how we now begin to address some of these issues. But most importantly, though, reframing the language is very critical, especially I want to speak to women of color. Historically, what we've seen, and this also I'm going to bring the journalists into this conversation, because journalists, when they're reporting on such issues, I mean, FGM, by the way, just a few facts, it's now 230 million girls and women are affected by, who are living with FGM, and those are the ones that have been recorded. So imagine the ones who haven't been recorded. A recent data came out from University of Birmingham looking at the mortality rate. Every 12 minutes, a girl will die. It's now the 4th biggest killer of African girls. It's actually the same numbers as children who are dying from malaria. But then go and compare the money that goes towards FGM versus the money that goes towards malaria. And remember, malaria, you really can't prevent. You can't help if a mosquito is going to bite you. But FGM, you can't stop. So imagine that. So this is this is the space survivors are navigating. Because when we're doing this, what message are we sending, especially to survivors who are black and brown girls? When we are saying your violence, no, it's not violence. Your one is traditional cultural practice. We're going to talk to community leaders. We're going to negotiate your body. That would never happen for white girls. So survivors deserve that same justice as any other girl in the world. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Leila. Thank you for those reflections. I now want to turn to the audiences before we conclude and come back to hear them reflect. Are there any questions? And if they're not questions, comments, please be brief. I see one hand up already there. I'll take 3 depending on the time, or possibly just 2. Go ahead. And please say who you are, your affiliation, and to the point.
Hello, my name is Anastasia, and I work on AI assistant that should help women to report on gender-based violence cases. Basically, the idea that women can record audio messages or share the cases, and then AI should give women all information about the first step, also maybe to generate the complaint with women consent, and also give, therapy, legal support information, and also fight with bureaucracy system. And to build this AI, we want to partner with NGO and therapists to do it together somehow. My question, do you really believe that technology can help, especially with fighting the systems? And any recommendations and feedback? Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll take one more. Any other comments, reflections? Yes.
Thank you very much for the very interesting interventions. I want to give a word of solidarity with Janine because I had a similar experience when it comes to feeling guilty. And it happened in Syria. I can briefly explain what happened, and I think it's good to share because sometimes we have this overwhelming sense of responsibility for things that are not completely under our control. So I had a friend and source of information in Atme, a village that is at the Syrian-Turkish border. And in a different occasion when I was myself kidnapped in Syria, and then, thank God, released, this person in Atme got in touch with me and he said, I was tortured just because I was one of your sources. And that obviously, it's something that, you live with, and it's hard. But I wonder, I mean, do we have that sort of responsibility all the time with us when we do our work? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, and we have to accept injustice as it is, because many people coexist with injustice.
Right.
So this is...
Thank you very much for those. Thank
I have
you.
a question for Leila.
No, excuse me. Just one question.
Sorry.
You've asked it. You can come up later and
Okay,
speak to
thank you.
Leila. Yes? Please, yes. So given the time, I want to turn back to the panelists. And actually what I want to say to the three of you is to reflect on your work as you reflect on what has just been shared. So let me begin with you, Leila, and then we'll walk this way, right?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, to all the journalists in the room, including Janine, who are carrying this guilt, it's okay to let it go. I think maybe let's begin that today, because I think that's not okay, that you were not given the information. So I think forgiving yourself is it's a beginning of your healing.
Yes.
And really get support. I really cannot stress that enough. So just wanted to start with that. And also the question around the AI. Technology absolutely plays a vital role to the world that we live in, but it has to be a co-working. It can't be techie people now thinking about how a therapist works. I think you have to bring key experts, therapists who work in sexual violence and torture. You really need, and journalists in that space to work together. I think that's the role the technology space will be playing, in my opinion. Yep.
Thank you, Leila. Thank you. Over to you, Janine.
Going back to my friend who confided your story, there is something called moral injury. Does anyone in the room, have you heard about it? It's a kind of counterpart to PTSD, which many journalists, but also humanitarians working in the field experience. And what moral injury is when you have this complete helplessness over a situation that you're deeply empathetic for, but you cannot control it. So for instance, watching what's happening in Gaza right now. Like, many of us feel absolutely destroyed, but there's very little we can do other than post about it. There's a psychiatrist here. He's going to give a session called Dr. Anthony Feinstein. He did the first ever study on PTSD and its effect on war reporters, frontline journalists, back in 2000. And he just finished a study on moral injury. I was part of both of his studies. I'm very proud to be part of his studies. But I just want to say that there is actually this thing. If you're working in the field and you're working with people who are in deep harm, suffering, you retain something. He calls it a scar on your soul. And I think, it's absolutely right what Leila said. You have to acknowledge it, but that it is there. And if we do this kind of work, which is difficult work in the field, we have to learn how to develop tools, whether it's deeper empathy, compassion, intuition. I mean, that's the one thing I think I've relied on in my very long career, is to kind of really keep my intuition strong. Is this person capable of giving me a testimony? Maybe they're not strong enough. Maybe I should wait a couple more days. Maybe they are traumatized. And I think there should be skills, you're right, taught to journalists or humanitarians about how to navigate this. And especially how you handle a situation if you're confronted with something and you need to make a decision, and that decision could affect someone's life. It could be a source that might be picked up later by the secret police. So it's just something to think about in our world of, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. Yes, final comments from you,
Um,
Liza?
so I guess more folks have spoken to this question of the ways in which you might harm without intending to. So I won't add much there. To the tech question, I think a bit like you said, technology is just a tool, right? And we it can either do good or harm. And when you describe what you're working on, it sounds like it has the potential to do great good. And as a journalist, when I listen to that, I think about, oh, if women are speaking to this, is it recording their voice? What is happening with their data? And also thinking about the ways in which our technologies, existing in a technological record. So for example, your identity, which in reality is much more fluid, but when it interacts with technology, it becomes fixed, right? And how does that not serve people, right? So if you have to then identify yourself in a specific way so that you can train your AI, what capacity do people have to rethink their identity? Because actually there's this idea of the Medusa effect, and actually technology looking at something freezes it in stone, and actually people's experience are much more fluid than that. So as someone who reports and is interested in reporting on these issues, objectively there is no good or bad technology. There's how technology is used. There's that technology that accounts for harm and that factors that in, as opposed to says, okay, we will launch this because more people can benefit and we will reckon with its harm later. A lot of humanitarian technologies do that, and that we see that they cause as much harm as technologies introduced by governments that are malicious or malevolent, etc. And for anyone interested in this area, there's a really neat little book by a writer called Zara Rahman called Machine Readable Me, and how the ways in which we exist in data sets might actually cause as much harm as good, and a lot of that is also gendered, so worth considering.
Thank you very much, Eliza. So we want to conclude here, and I want to conclude just with the following very quick reflection. I think, as you've heard from our panelists, women's voices are indeed really valid sources of knowledge, of evidence, and of data. But we must pay closer attention to how do we gather those stories, because it has consequences for the women and girls from whom we gather those stories, but it also has consequences for those who collect those stories. And therefore, what skills will be needed? What support will be needed? And I want to really thank this panel for just what you've shared today, the powerful stories you've let the audience hear, and huge, huge thank you. All the very best.